Today you are going to hear a story that will touch your heart. The journey of Grace and Warrior, the pit bull who surprised everyone by saving his new family. In a small town in Montana, USA, an unlikely friendship blossoms and forever changes the lives of a little girl and her loyal protector. If you love heartwarming stories of overcoming adversity, friendship, and heroic animals, this is the perfect story for you. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your comment telling us where you are watching from. Your subscription and likes are free and help YouTube show this story to more people who love animals. Subscribe and leave your like. Enjoy every moment of this journey. What would happen if the love and loyalty of a dog could heal a child's greatest fears? In a small rural town in Montana, Grace, a 3-year-old girl, lives in a world that, although peaceful, is marked by loneliness. After the loss of her father, her mother, Helen, struggles every day to support the family, leaving little time to share moments with her daughter. Isolated in an environment where the closeness of friends and neighbors is just a distant dream, Grace finds herself trapped in a universe where her only companions are her own thoughts and dreams, leading her to imagine a friend who understands and fulfills her. Grace's life changes drastically one ordinary afternoon when an unexpected visitor knocks at the door. A large pit bull, with tired eyes and scars that speak of a painful past. What could be seen as a threat transforms into a magical encounter. Grace, with her pure heart, decides to name the dog Warrior, and soon they establish a silent yet deep connection. Warrior, far from being a dangerous animal, brings with him a protective instinct that goes beyond what Grace could imagine. However, the serenity of their new friendship is tested when thieves invade Grace and Helen's home. In a moment of desperation, Warrior reveals his true nature, defending the two from an attack that could have tragic consequences. The community, which initially views the pit bull with suspicion, begins to understand that he is more than just a scary appearance. He is a hero who has come to transform their lives. Warrior's presence brings Grace not only a companion, but also the hope of a future where loneliness is no longer a constant. Their relationship blossoms, bringing a new sense of belonging and happiness to both. Warrior, with his loyal heart and unwavering courage, becomes a symbol of determination and protection, not just for Grace, but for the entire community that learns to value the true essence behind appearances. As Grace adapts to this new reality, she begins to understand that love and friendship can arise from the most unexpected places. Warrior is not just a stray dog. He is a companion who teaches her and her mother valuable lessons about loyalty, overcoming challenges, and the importance of not judging by appearances. Their journey is filled with emotions, challenges, and the transformative power of love, touching the hearts of all who know their story. Grace, at her tender age, discovers that despite life's difficulties, there is always room for hope and friendship. Warrior is not just an animal. He is a savior who transforms her loneliness into joy and brings a new purpose to the lives of Grace and Helen. With a narrative that explores the deep bonds between humans and animals, this story is a touching reminder that sometimes love can come from the most unexpected places. Grace and Warrior's life seemed to have found a comfortable rhythm, but the tranquility was illusory. In the weeks following the robbery attack, the small town in Montana began to change. While Warrior's presence became an increasing source of security and joy for Grace, fear and distrust still loomed over the community. Some people still saw the pit bull as a threat, and this judgment began to affect Helen. Helen, struggling to keep a job and care for her daughter, felt the pressure from the community. She often heard murmurs in shops and on the streets. What if Warrior became aggressive? What if he attacked a child? These comments weighed on her heart, and each day it became harder for her to defend Grace's friendship with the dog. Grace, on the other hand, did not understand the adults' concerns. To her, Warrior was a loyal friend, always by her side, always ready to play or offer comfort. However, one day, while playing in the yard, a group of neighborhood children approached. Curious but cautious, they looked at Warrior with distrust. "He is dangerous," one of them whispered to the others. Grace, hearing this, felt a tightness in her chest. How could someone think her beloved friend was dangerous? What began as a sunny day soon turned into a moment of tension. The children, frightened, backed away, and Grace, feeling rejected, called Warrior close. The pit bull, sensing her discomfort, sat beside her, looking at the children with a calmness that only he possessed. But the girl's words echoed like a sound of loneliness. "He won't hurt you," Grace said, her voice small and trembling. "He is my friend." This incident deeply shook the girl. She began to question whether Warrior was really that special. Doubts started to seep into her mind, and the joy she once felt with the dog began to mix with a sad uncertainty. What would happen if people never accepted Warrior? What if he became a source of problems for her mother? Meanwhile, at home, Helen faced her own challenges. Work at the local store was becoming increasingly stressful. The pressure for results and the gossip about Warrior left her exhausted. One night, when she returned home, she found Grace hugging Warrior, crying silently. "Mom, why don't the kids like him?" the girl asked. Her voice choked. Helen felt her heart tighten. She knew Grace's friendship with Warrior was pure and true, but the reality of society was cruel. "People are afraid of what they don't know, dear," she replied, trying to find words to comfort her daughter. "But that doesn't mean you should stop loving your friend." The conversation left Helen deep in thought. She realized she needed to defend Warrior not only to protect her daughter's friendship, but also to protect the dog himself, who had become part of their family. However, the concern for Grace's safety made her hesitate. What if, in her defense, she failed? The dilemma made her feel lost. Meanwhile, tension in the town was escalating. A new group of residents began to organize, calling for an order that would prohibit dogs of certain breeds deemed dangerous. Helen, hearing these discussions, felt the need to act. She started looking for information about Warrior's history, his traumas, and his victories. The pit bull was an example of overcoming adversity, and his journey deserved to be shared. Grace, for her part, began to feel lonely. The children were avoiding her, and the friendship that had blossomed between her and Warrior was becoming an island amid a sea of solitude. She remembered moments when Warrior made her laugh, when he jumped happily, wagging his tail, and how safe she felt in his presence. But now, fear and rejection became shadows threatening to extinguish that light. Amid this emotional storm, Grace decided she would not allow the fear of others to separate her from Warrior. With her heart filled with courage, she prepared to face her own fears and the community's distrust. She knew she needed to fight for the friendship that was so important to her, and that Warrior, with his unconditional love, also deserved that fight. And so, Grace and Warrior's journey in search of acceptance and understanding was about to begin, testing them in ways they could never have imagined. Grace was determined to fight for the friendship she had with Warrior, but external pressure weighed on her like a dark cloud. The next day brought news of a community meeting where residents would discuss concerns about dogs of breeds considered dangerous. Grace's heart raced when she heard her mother mention it. She knew Warrior would be at the center of the discussion, and the idea that her friend could be seen as a threat distressed her. At school, the situation grew increasingly difficult. The children, influenced by what they heard from adults, started to make hurtful comments about Warrior. One would say, "He's going to bite you." Another would chime in, "You shouldn't play with him." With each word, Grace felt a deep pain, as if they were attacking not only Warrior, but her own heart as well. The friendship that once made her strong now left her feeling vulnerable and alone. Helen, noticing her daughter's sadness, decided to join her. They began to plan a way to show the community that Warrior was a kind and loving dog. "We need to show them who he really is," Helen said, while Grace nodded, filled with hope. Together, they thought about organizing an adoption and socialization day at the city park, where Warrior could interact with other children and dogs. Helen believed this could be a way to break down the barriers of fear and distrust. However, as the day of the meeting approached, Grace's anxiety grew. She recalled moments when Warrior had been rejected during walks or when people crossed the street upon seeing him. The fear she felt was not just for her friend, but also for the possibility of losing the battle for acceptance. What if the community decided to ban dogs like Warrior? The thought terrified her. In the meantime, the group advocating for the prohibition of specific dog breeds gained momentum. One of its leaders, a man named Ted, began to spread stories about dog attacks. He had a convincing tone, and many residents started to rally around him. Helen watched everything with concern, knowing that time was running out. She felt trapped between her love for Warrior and the need to protect her daughter and the community. The day of the meeting arrived, and the room was packed. Grace sat next to her mother, feeling a knot in her stomach. When Ted began to speak, his eyes shone with determination. He presented data on dog attacks and emphasized the danger they posed. With each word, Grace's heart sank. People began nodding in agreement, which made her even more anxious. Helen stood up to defend Warrior. With a trembling but firm voice, she shared the story of the dog, how he had been rescued, and how his gentle nature had changed Grace's life. The story resonated in the room, and some residents seemed touched. But Ted did not back down. He seized the moment's vulnerability and began to attack Helen herself, questioning her ability as a mother and suggesting that she was putting her daughter's life at risk. Grace felt a wave of indignation. How could someone attack her mother like that? She stood up, feeling courage grow within her. "Warrior is not dangerous," she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "He is my friend. He has never hurt anyone." The silence that followed was palpable. All eyes turned to Grace, and in that moment, she realized she was in a battle not only for Warrior's acceptance but for her own voice and identity. The tension in the room escalated, and the meeting quickly turned into a heated debate. Grace, amidst the conflict, felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she knew she had to keep fighting. Amidst the chaos, she saw Warrior sitting in a corner, looking at her with his gentle, understanding eyes. He would always be by her side, no matter what happened. By the end of the meeting, the situation remained uncertain. Some people seemed convinced, while others held firm to their beliefs. Helen and Grace left the room with heavy hearts, but also with a newfound sense of determination. They needed to continue fighting, not just for Warrior's acceptance, but for all the lessons they were learning about courage, love, and the importance of standing up for those we care about. The road ahead would be difficult, and Grace knew there would be more challenges to face. But looking at Warrior, she felt that together they could overcome any obstacle. The fight for acceptance had begun, and she was ready to face whatever came their way, no matter how scary it might seem. The tension in the meeting room was palpable, and Grace felt the weight of unspoken words. After her statement, a tense silence enveloped the space, but it was soon broken by an elderly woman who, with a trembling voice, began to speak. She reminisced about her own dog, one that had been considered dangerous. She said he had never harmed her and had always been loyal. The problem, she asserted, was not the breed, but the way dogs are treated. The woman's words brought a new perspective to the discussion, but Ted remained unfazed. He countered, claiming that childhood stories were insufficient to justify the presence of potentially dangerous dogs on the streets. The debate quickly escalated into a heated exchange, filled with shouting and interruptions. Grace glanced at her mother, who looked increasingly worried. It was then that something unexpected happened. One of the residents, a young man studying veterinary medicine, stood up and asked to speak. He expressed that he couldn't remain silent, his voice steady. As future caretakers of animals, he insisted they needed to understand that dogs reflect the environment they live in. Warrior was not just a breed, he was a being deserving of love and respect, just like any other. The young man's words brought a fresh air to the room. Grace felt a flicker of hope, but reality soon hit her hard. What if all of this was in vain? What if the decision had already been made? A feeling of despair began to take root in her heart, like a shadow that refused to leave. At that moment, The insecurities and fears she had harbored started to manifest. What would happen if Warrior were taken away? The thought terrified her. The meeting dragged on, and Grace realized that the battle was far from won. Frustration overwhelmed her, and a wave of tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. She remembered all the times she had felt alone and misunderstood, how Warrior had always been by her side when everyone else had turned away. The intensity of her emotions made her reconsider her choices. Was fighting really the solution? Was she truly ready to face the community's rejection? As the discussion continued, Grace stood up once more. She challenged them, asking, if they didn't believe her and her mother, why not see for themselves who Warrior was? How about a day in the park where they could meet him? He was not a monster. He was a friend. A dog who loved and deserved to be loved in return. Grace's words resonated in the room, and a murmur of surprise swept through the crowd. The idea of a meeting with Warrior began to gain traction, but uncertainty still lingered in the air. Ted, furious, tried to dismiss the proposal, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Some people began whispering to each other, and Grace sensed an opportunity. As she left the meeting, her heart was torn. A new hope had emerged, but the fight was still far from over. Looking at her mother, she saw that Helen was also deep in thought. They shared a silence that spoke more than 1,000 words. They knew the struggle for Warrior was just beginning. In the days that followed, Grace dedicated herself to planning the event. She recalled all the times Warrior had brought joy to her life and resolved not to let fear and ignorance defeat her. The idea of a socialization day in the park began to take shape, and she was determined to do everything in her power to ensure Warrior was accepted. But as the event approached, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. Grace began to doubt. What if people didn't come? What if Warrior misbehaved? Doubtful voices started to whisper in her mind, and the pressure of fighting for a friend left her paralyzed. What would happen if everything fell apart? The day of the event arrived, and Grace was anxious. The park was decorated, and Warrior seemed as excited as she was, but uncertainty wrapped around her like a fog. When the first people began to arrive, her heart raced. What if no one wanted to stay? What if fear spoke louder than reason? To her surprise, curiosity triumphed over distrust. Children began to approach, and soon they were running and playing with Warrior, laughing and enjoying themselves. Grace watched, overcome with emotion, as her friend interacted with everyone, revealing his true self. In that moment, she realized that the battle she was fighting was not only for Warrior's acceptance but also for her own. She was learning to be brave, to speak for those who could not, and to defend the love she felt. The event was becoming a success, and the meeting room now felt like a distant echo of her worries. The struggle was far from over, but Grace felt she was starting to find herself, and with Warrior by her side, nothing could truly stop her. Grace watched the park, now filled with laughter and play. Warrior joyfully ran among the children, his tail wagging like a sign of contagious happiness. The tension she had felt before the meeting now seemed like a distant nightmare. However, even with the joy surrounding her, a shadow of concern lingered in her heart. She knew that this day was just the beginning. Although the children were having fun and the adults showed growing curiosity, Grace could not ignore the murmurs that still existed in the community. The presence of Ted and his followers loomed like a dark cloud over the event. Fear and distrust did not easily dissipate, and Grace understood that she would need more than a fun day to change people's mindsets. As she watched Warrior play, Grace recalled the words of the elderly woman from the meeting. The problem is not the breed, but the way dogs are treated. These words echoed in her mind, and she felt compelled to do more. Determined to continue the fight for Warrior's acceptance, Grace began to think about how she could turn this event into an educational opportunity. What if I give a presentation on dog care and training? She thought. This idea made her heart race. She could invite professionals and experts to talk about the importance of love and respect for animals. With this approach, she could not only advocate for Warrior, but also educate the community on how to create a safe environment for everyone. When the event ended and the guests began to disperse, Grace approached her mother. "Mom, I want to do something more. We can't stop here. We need to show everyone that Warrior is a good dog, that it's the way we treat animals that matters." Helen looked at her daughter, impressed. "I think that's a great idea, Grace. You are truly growing and becoming an amazing advocate." Her mother's words brought a smile to Grace's face, but also a new wave of anxiety. How would she manage to organize all of this? She had no experience, and the fear of failure began to haunt her again. In the following days, Grace immersed herself in research. She sought information on animal behavior specialists, trainers, and veterinarians willing to participate in the event. But with each step, new obstacles arose. Many professionals were busy or had reservations about Warrior, and Grace found herself struggling against frustration. Emotional exhaustion began to weigh on her, and sleepless nights became frequent. What if people don't come? What if they think this is just a waste of time? These thoughts haunted her as she tried to keep hope alive. In moments of despair, she sat with Warrior, stroking his soft fur, seeking comfort in his presence. The intuitive dog seemed to sense her anxiety and snuggled closer, as if to say, "I'm here. Don't worry." The day of the new event arrived, and Grace felt her heart racing. She had managed to gather some experts and was eager to see how the community would react. However, deep down, there was a persistent fear that everything could fall apart. What if Ted showed up and triggered distrust again? The park was decorated, and a sense of anticipation hung in the air. As the guests began to arrive, Grace tried to remain calm, but she could not ignore the tension she felt. When she saw Ted and some of his followers approaching, her stomach churned. What would they do? What would they say? To her surprise, Ted was not hostile. He seemed curious, but distrust still lingered in his gaze. Grace decided she needed to act. With courage, she approached him and said, "Ted, I know you have your concerns, but I promise Warrior is a good dog. He deserves a chance." Ted looked at her for a moment, and then slowly. The tension in his face began to fade. "I just want to ensure everyone's safety, Grace. But I'm willing to listen." That small opening was a relief. Grace realized that even though the fight would be long, every step forward, every conversation, could make a difference. The event began, and the experts shared their experiences and teachings, while Warrior behaved exemplary, interacting with everyone around him. With each smile and compliment, Grace's confidence grew, and she felt she was truly making a difference. But the journey was far from over. She knew there would still be challenges ahead. The fight for Warrior's acceptance and for changing the community's mindset would not be easy. But with each step she took, Grace felt stronger and more determined. She was learning to accept herself, to fight for what she loved, and, more importantly, not to give up, even when difficulties arose. The love she felt for Warrior was more powerful than any fear or doubt, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Grace watched the park, now filled with laughter and play. Warrior joyfully ran among the children, his tail wagging like a sign of contagious happiness. The tension she had felt before the meeting now seemed like a distant nightmare. However, even with the joy around her, a shadow of concern lingered in her heart. She knew that this day was just the beginning. While the children were having fun and the adults showed growing curiosity, Grace couldn't ignore the murmurs that still existed in the community. The presence of Ted and his followers still loomed like a dark cloud over the event. Fear and distrust didn't vanish so easily, and Grace knew she would need more than a fun day to change people's mindsets. As she watched Warrior play, Grace recalled the words of the elderly woman at the meeting. "The problem is not the breed, but how the dogs are treated." Those words echoed in her mind, and she felt compelled to do more. Determined to continue the fight for Warrior's acceptance, Grace began to think about how she could turn this event into an educational opportunity. "What if I do a presentation on dog care and training?" she thought. This idea made her heart race. She could invite professionals and experts to talk about the importance of love and respect for animals, With this approach, she could not only advocate for Warrior but also educate the community on how to create a safe environment for everyone. When the event ended and the guests began to disperse, Grace approached her mother. "Mom, I want to do something more. We can't stop here. We need to show everyone that Warrior is a good dog, that it's how we treat animals that matters." Helen looked at her daughter, impressed. "I think that's a great idea, Grace. You're really growing and becoming an incredible advocate." Her mother's words brought a smile to Grace's face but also a new wave of anxiety. How would she manage to organize all of this? She had no experience, and the fear of failure began to haunt her again. In the following days, Grace immersed herself in research. She sought information about animal behavior specialists, trainers, and veterinarians willing to participate in the event. But with each step, new obstacles arose. Many professionals were busy or had reservations about Warrior, and Grace found herself battling frustration. Emotional exhaustion began to weigh on her, and sleepless nights became frequent. What if people don't come? What if they think this is just a waste of time? Those thoughts haunted her as she tried to keep hope alive. In moments of despair, she would sit with Warrior, stroking his soft fur, seeking comfort in his presence. The dog, always intuitive, seemed to sense her anxiety and snuggled closer, as if to say, "I'm here, don't worry." The day of the new event arrived, and Grace felt her heart racing. She had managed to gather a few specialists and was eager to see how the community would react. However, deep down, there was a lingering fear that everything could fall apart. What if Ted showed up and triggered distrust again? The park was decorated, and a sense of anticipation hung in the air. As guests began to arrive, Grace tried to stay calm, but she couldn't ignore the tension she felt. When she saw Ted and some of his followers approaching, her stomach churned. What would they do? What would they say? To her surprise, Ted was not hostile. He seemed curious, but distrust was still present in his gaze. Grace decided she needed to act. With courage, she approached him and said, "Ted, I know you have your concerns, but I promise Warrior is a good dog. He deserves a chance." Ted stared at her for a moment, and then slowly, the tension in his face began to fade. "I just want to ensure everyone's safety, Grace. But I'm willing to listen." That small opening was a relief. Grace realized that even though the fight would be long, each step forward, each conversation, could make a difference. The event began, and the specialists shared their experiences and teachings while Warrior behaved exemplary, interacting with everyone around him. With each smile and each compliment, Grace's confidence grew, and she felt she was truly making a difference. But the journey was far from over. She knew there would still be challenges ahead. The fight for Warrior's acceptance and for changing the community's mindset would not be easy. But with each step she took, Grace felt stronger and more determined. She was learning to accept herself, to fight for what she loved, and, more importantly, to not give up even when difficulties arose. The love she felt for Warrior was more powerful than any fear or doubt, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Grace had not only become an advocate for Warrior, she had transformed into an advocate for all misunderstood animals. The lessons she learned on her journey were not just about dogs, but about the importance of empathy and courage. Now, she saw herself as an agent of change, and each small success propelled her to continue. The transformation began within her, and she knew that together, her actions could lead to a brighter and more welcoming future for all. The event was in full swing, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Grace observed the people around her, noting familiar and unfamiliar faces, all united by a common purpose: to learn more about dogs and, especially, about Warrior. However, her mind couldn't shake the presence of Ted and his followers. Tension grew with every passing minute, and Grace knew this was her biggest challenge. As the expert spoke, Grace struggled to maintain her focus. She was nervous but also determined. The decisive moment was approaching, and she needed to show everyone that Warrior was a good dog. It was time to act. When the last speaker finished, Grace stood up and requested everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice a little shaky. "I'm very happy that you want to learn how to care for and respect our four-legged friends. But more importantly, I want to talk about Warrior. He is not just a dog. He is part of my family." She paused, looking at Warrior, who sat beside her, gazing at the crowd with bright eyes. "I know some people are afraid of him, but I am here to show that what really matters is how we treat animals. Warrior is gentle, loving, and deserves to be loved, just like any other dog." Those words hung in the air, but doubt still lingered over the crowd, and Grace could sense their unease. So, she decided it was time for an act of courage. "If you are willing, I would like to invite those who are afraid of Warrior to come closer and see him up close. He won't bite. I promise." A heavy silence fell over the park. Some people looked at Ted, who stood in a corner, observing everything with a critical eye. Grace's heart raced. What if no one approached? What if all of this was in vain? Finally, a young mother raised her hand. "I will. I want to see what he's really like." With a nervous smile, she led her child toward Warrior. Grace focused, trying to convey the confidence she wanted others to see. Warrior, sensing the approach, wagged his tail and sat patiently. When the mother and her child got close, Warrior leaned in as if asking for affection. The boy, hesitant, reached out his hand, and upon touching Warrior's soft fur, his face lit up. "He's so cute," he exclaimed, and the mother smiled, relieved. The tension began to dissipate, and others started to approach one by one. Grace felt a warmth growing inside her. The words of the elderly woman came back to her mind, and she realized she was doing exactly what needed to be done. She was not only defending Warrior but also promoting empathy. Laughter and whispers of surprise began to spread through the park as more and more people approached the dog. Then, Ted stepped forward. "Can I try too?" he asked, his voice softer than Grace expected. She looked at him, a mix of surprise and hope. "Of course," she replied, trying to hide her anxiety. This was a valuable opportunity. If Ted could see Warrior through different eyes, perhaps the community could change as well. Ted approached slowly, and Warrior, always friendly, sat again, wagging his tail. As Ted extended his hand, Grace held her breath. The world seemed to slow down as he touched the dog. The expression on his face began to change, and for a brief moment, Grace saw a glimpse of understanding in his eyes. "He's really different from what I thought," Ted said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "I feel like he just wants to be loved." Those words were like a ray of light. Grace felt the struggle was worth it, that change was possible. The crowd, now animated, began to gather closer. Children were laughing, petting Warrior, and adults were discussing what they had learned. Grace looked around and saw that distrust was dissipating, giving way to a new connection. Grace's journey had not been easy, but in that moment, she felt she had overcome her biggest challenge. She hadn't just defended Warrior. She had opened the eyes of the community to the true nature of love and empathy. The fight that seemed endless was now becoming a path of hope. That day, Grace realized that change begins within us. She had faced her fears and, more importantly, had shown others that with love and understanding, it is possible to transform prejudice into friendship. The journey was not over yet, but she knew she was on the right path. Warrior was more than a dog. He was proof that true strength lies in the ability to love and accept, even when everything seems difficult. And, with a smile on her face, Grace felt ready to face any challenge life presented her. The atmosphere in the park had completely changed. What was once a space filled with tension now pulsed with laughter and animated conversations. Grace watched people interacting with Warrior, her heart light, relieved to see that her message had been heard. She knew there was still a long way to go, but that moment was a significant milestone. As the children played, petting Warrior, Grace approached Ted, who was standing next to the young mother who had been the first to approach the dog. Ted admitted, looking at Warrior with newfound respect, that he had never imagined he could be like this. He had been so focused on what he didn't know that he couldn't see how special Warrior truly was. Grace smiled, feeling a warmth grow within her. She said that often. Fear comes from ignorance. But today they had all learned a little more about the love they could share with their animals. It was an important step for all of them. Ted nodded thoughtfully, suggesting that they needed to hold more events like this, bringing people together, talking about dogs, and how they should treat them could be a good way to educate the community. The idea resonated with Grace. It was exactly what they needed, an opportunity to continue this conversation, to turn prejudices into understanding. Absolutely. They could organize workshops, lectures, and even adoption events, Grace suggested excitedly. It would be a way to show that, with a little patience and love, they could change lives. The enthusiasm in her voice was contagious, and Ted began to smile, envisioning a better future. As they talked, Grace noticed that more people had started to gather around them. The young mother, now more confident, spoke up, saying that she had never known she could have a dog like this. Warrior had really made her see how incredible they could be. The group nodded, sharing stories about their own pets and how, at times, fear had prevented them from connecting with them. Grace felt a wave of gratitude. What had started as an event to advocate for Warrior was now becoming a celebration of love for animals. The transformation was not just in Ted, but in everyone around him. People who had once hesitated were now coming together, eager to learn more about caring for dogs and ways to deal with differences. As the afternoon progressed, Grace decided to take a brief pause to collect herself. She stepped away from the hustle and bustle and sat on a bench, watching Warrior play with the children. The dog looked so happy, and it touched her heart in a profound way. She reflected on what that day meant for her. It was not just about advocating for her dog, but about uniting a community around a greater purpose. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. It was the elderly lady who had shared her words of encouragement at the beginning of the event. She expressed her happiness for Grace, stating that she had done an incredible job. Grace smiled, feeling grateful. She just wanted people to see what she saw in Warrior. The lady nodded, her eyes shining with approval, saying that Grace had done more than that. She had brought people together, and that was a gift. Grace responded, filled with hope, that she hoped they could continue like this. She wanted everyone to learn to love and respect animals as they deserved. The lady smiled, and Grace felt she was on the right path. When she returned to the group, the energy was even more vibrant. People were connecting, sharing information, and even planning the next meeting. Grace realized that the struggle she had faced was not just about Warrior, but about creating a community that understood the importance of love and empathy. That day, she not only defended a dog, she became an advocate for change. Warrior, with his affectionate nature, had opened doors that seemed closed. Now, Grace was surrounded by people united by the same passion. The happiness radiating from the group was contagious, and she knew she had planted seeds of love that would blossom into something beautiful. As the sun set, casting a soft glow over the park, Grace looked at Warrior. He seemed radiant, surrounded by children laughing and playing. Grace smiled, knowing that from that day on she and Warrior would be ready to face any challenge together, with a community willing to learn and love. Grace observed the park, now filled with joy and connection. The laughter of the children playing with Warrior echoed, creating a melody of love and acceptance. The journey she had faced, marked by uncertainties and fears, had transformed into a celebration of life and friendship. Warrior, with his affectionate nature, not only won the hearts of the children but also disarmed the adults who had previously hesitated to approach. As she chatted with the participants, Grace realized how much she had changed. Once, she felt isolated, fighting alone to defend her dog. Now, surrounded by a community that understood the importance of respect and love for animals, she felt strong and supported. Her determination to educate and unite people had created a bond among them, a connection that transcended prejudices and fears. The event had become a success, and ideas for future gatherings were starting to take shape. Grace reflected on the power that empathy and communication can hold. She had learned that often, the barriers we create in our minds can be broken down with simple acts of kindness and understanding. There was a unique beauty in the diversity of opinions, and now, more than ever, she believed that change was possible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Grace felt a wave of gratitude. She looked at Warrior, who seemed radiant, surrounded by new friends, and smiled. The home they had built together, filled with love and understanding, now extended beyond the borders of their house. The struggle that once seemed solitary had now become a collective endeavor, a joint effort from everyone involved. Grace realized that every smile, every word of encouragement, and every gesture of affection were steps toward a kinder world. She had learned that by defending Warrior, she had become an advocate for change, a voice for those who could not speak. The true victory was not just about Warrior's recognition, but about the transformation it brought to everyone around her. As the park lights began to twinkle, Grace felt a renewed determination. She was ready to continue this journey, to help others connect with their animals and with each other. The empathy she had cultivated that day was just the beginning. There was so much to do, and she knew that together, they could create something even more beautiful. The story of Grace and Warrior was a lesson about love, resilience, and the importance of being open to new experiences. The friendship that blossomed in that park was a testament to the power each of us has to make a difference. So, she invited everyone around her to reflect on their own experiences with animals and to share their stories. "Let's continue this conversation," she said. "Let's unite for a kinder and more loving world." And so, with hearts full of hope, Grace and Warrior knew they were just getting started. They had not only changed their lives, but had also inspired an entire community to become a place where love for animals and people prevailed. The future shone brightly ahead of them, and every step taken would be a celebration of friendship, resilience, and kindness. If you've also had a transformative experience, share it with us in the comments. Let's spread the message of love and empathy together. Like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that inspire us to make a difference. The time to act is now. What was the moment that touched your heart the most or left you speechless? We really want to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share your reflections with us. Your perspective is essential and helps us bring even more emotional stories. If you know someone who would be inspired by this story of Warrior and Grace, share the video with them. Let's spread moments that inspire and show the power of friendship between humans and animals together. And if you're eager for more incredible stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you'll be the first to know when we release more exciting adventures. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like.
I really want to read your opinion about the story in the comments. Until next time, thank you for watching, and see you at the next emotional story.